Well, for many years now, indeed, in my case, decades, people called conspiracy theorists have largely been ignored. When they've not been ignored, they've been dismissed as nutters, lunatics, people talking nonsense. But now there is an increasing attempt by different expressions of authority to tell people why they shouldn't listen to people like me and why people like me are not credible to be listened to. That what we say has no validity. Now, if that is true, then what do you have to tell people for? If they're just nutters, well, leave them. They're not a problem, are they? Who's going to believe nutters? Not many. The problem for them is that what we're saying does have validity. And people perceiving world events are increasingly realizing that it makes more sense to see that these events are manipulated into place rather than they're acting or happening by random accident. And so this problem is being met with more and more attempts to dismiss and discredit people who are actually uncovering what's really happening, as opposed to the movie script that we're told by the mainstream media. We've had in very recent times the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, feeling it necessary for some reason to say publicly that the conspiracy, because that's what it is, to manipulate the result of the EU referendum, in and out public referendum, is not a David Icke style conspiracy. Why would he feel the need to say that? And we're having academia more and more coming in, saying that people that believe in conspiracy theories have some kind of psychological problem. And if that's true, what is the problem for authority that makes it feel the need to try more and more, and we've seen nothing yet, to discredit those who are uncovering what those in authority don't want the public to know? This is David Cameron. He took a break in 2014 from selling snake oil to speak at the UN General Assembly. And he was talking about conspiracies when it was about defeating the ideology of extremism. The peddling of lies about a 9/11 plot, or that the 7/7 London attacks were staged, and the idea that Muslims are persecuted all over the world as a deliberate act of Western policy are conspiracy theories. The fact that Muslims are being persecuted all over the world as a deliberate act of Western policy is a conspiracy theory. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. It's not happening, it's just a theory. And talking about the conspiracy theory of a concept of an inevitable clash of civilizations. It's happening. And even though they're all true, because they're all true, they have to be discredited with this term conspiracy theorist or conspiracy theory, which actually came into more widespread use as a result of a deliberate policy of using that term by the CIA to discredit those uncovering the real background to the Kennedy assassination and other assassinations in the 60s, like that of Martin Luther King. We must be clear, Snake Oil Man went on, To defeat the ideology of extremism, we need to deal with all forms of extremism, not just violent extremism. Now, I'm going to pass that, not just violent extremism, through our Orwellian translation unit. And it comes out as, we must silence those telling the truth about what we're really doing. He goes on. For governments, there are some obvious ways we can do this. We must ban preachers of hate from coming to our countries. We must prescribe organizations that incite terrorism against people at home and abroad. Now, that's the front. A lot of people now, genuine peaceful protesters and activists, are asking why they are being prosecuted or blocked by laws that were brought in on the pretext of fighting terrorism. Because the answer is that that's exactly what it was, a pretext. You look at these anti-terrorism laws and they're so widely applicable in the way they're written on purpose that they can be applied against anybody. That's the idea, just to get them in. So when Cameron's talking here about extremism and terrorism, what he's really talking about is, in the wider context, as we move through, targeting those who are uncovering the truth or protesting about government policy. He says we must stop the so-called non-violent extremists. Non-violent extremists are people who are exposing through words and peaceful ways what the government is and the authorities in general are really doing. We must stop the so-called non-violent extremists from inciting hatred and intolerance in our schools, our universities, and yes, even our prisons. Intolerance. Intolerance for governments lying to us is what he's talking about. Of course, he says, there will be those who will argue that this is not compatible with free speech and intellectual inquiry. He should have added, but then that's the idea. So we shouldn't stand by and just allow any form of non-violent extremism exposing the government peacefully. But the right-wing extremists in government, they're not a problem. And the racists in government, they're not a problem. And he says to combat this, we must support the building blocks of free and open societies. So when's he going to start in Britain then? This is a man who is so blatantly manipulating and engineering through lies and suppression of the alternative to the lies, the European referendum, talking about a free and open society. And then, after 9/11, when all that mayhem's taking place, George Bush, boy George Bush, said, again in an address to the United Nations, November the 10th, 2001, he denounced the emergence of, quote, outrageous conspiracy theories that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty. Again, all that mayhem, and he has to go out and make a specific point about conspiracy theories, giving another version of really what happened on 9/11. Why? Because the official story of 9/11 is so full of holes. It's a joke. And it's not about shifting blame away from the terrorists. It's shifting the blame away from the patsies and those blamed for it to hide the fact that the real terrorists, those in the shadows that were ultimately controlling Boy Bush, were the real people responsible for 9/11. Then we have the Obama administration. Top Obama czar infiltrate all conspiracy theorists. We're nutters, right? What's the problem? We're not. That's the problem. Story goes, in a lengthy academic paper, President Obama's regulatory czar, Cass Sunstein, argued the US government should ban conspiracy theorizing. Among the beliefs Sunstein would ban is advocating that the theory of global warming is a deliberate fraud, which it is. Now, if the basis of the global warming claims is so powerful and so obvious and so overwhelming, what is the problem of nutters challenging that official story? What problem could something that is so blatantly true, so they claim, have with a few people saying it's not? To the point where the US government should ban conspiracy theorizing. Why? Because, just like 9/11, the official story of global warming and what became climate change when the temperature stopped rising is as full of holes and as nonsensical and as unsustainable as what happened on September the 11th, 2001, according to the official story. Sunstein also recommended the government send agents to infiltrate extremists who supply conspiracy theories to disrupt the efforts of the extremists to propagate their theories. Note, what we're seeing, just mentioned it, but the confirmation goes on and on now. They're trying to associate people who expose conspiracies behind world events. In fact, if people read my books at length, it's actually one gigantic conspiracy with many faces. They are equating, or trying to in the public mind, extremism, extremists, fear, with people called conspiracy, or poke yourself in the eye, people called conspiracy theorists who are exposing the government. In a 2008 Harvard law paper, Conspiracy Theories, how appropriate, Sunstein and a co-author who was a Harvard law professor, ooh, he must be clever, ask, what can government do about conspiracy theories? I've got a question. Why do they feel there's anything to do about them if they're so nonsensical and obviously so? Quote, we can readily imagine a series of possible responses. One, government might ban conspiracy theorizing. Two, I mean, you know, pinch me. Ouch, it's true, he actually said this. Governments might impose some kind of tax, financial or otherwise, on those who disseminate such theories. In a 30-page paper, Sunstein argues the best government response to conspiracy theories is cognitive infiltration of extremist groups. Why? They're nutters, aren't they? As I keep asking. Then, we've got the academic side. You know, God save us from academia. Please. I'll be a good boy. Just God save us from academia. This is a story this week. Believe in conspiracy theories? You're probably a narcissist. People who doubt, in effect, what they're saying, official versions of events, are likely to be selfish and attention-seeking. Whoa. It goes on. Through a number of online studies, not many it turns out, researchers at the University of Kent have showed strong links between the belief in conspiracy theories and those with narcissism and low self-esteem. Who says they found it? They did. In the internet age, conspiracy theories can incubate in quiet corners of the web. Ooh. But it may be psychological predispositions of believers which keep them alive rather than cold, hard facts. See, what they do with so-called conspiracy theories and conspiracy research is they give the impression all the time that it's just a theory. You know, they're just sitting in a darkened room and coming to these conclusions. This is just one of my books. Thin, isn't it? The background information, the background supporting evidence for the fact that there is a global conspiracy to turn this into a global prison state, unfolding by the day, by the way, just watch the news and your own life experience, that somehow there is no evidence when it's enormous. But they don't go there, because they go there, they're on a loser. Let's have an open debate about this. No, they don't. I was on a television program once with an academic from University of London, I think it was. And this is a guy who, for anything alternative whatsoever, is akin to him to garlic to a vampire. He comes from the Richard Dawkins school of the concrete mind. And he's having a go at what I'm saying and what have you, as the cameras are rolling. And I said to him, have you ever read any of my books? And he said, no. So how do you know what I'm saying, especially in detail? I've read it in the papers. This is an academic that we're supposed to be taking seriously in terms of some kind of knowledge of what they're talking about. Anyway, this story goes on about the University of Kent. Over the course of 3 online-based studies, researchers at the University of Kent showed strong links between the belief in conspiracy theories and negative psychological traits. Writing in the journal Social, Psychological and Personality Science, the team explained. Previous research linked the endorsement of conspiracy theories to low self-esteem. Now, one of the things that's building up here, and you'll see build up more and more, is not just a connection between those that can see conspiracies to manipulate world events and terrorism, terrorists, but also the link between people that believe the government's lying and people with psychological problems. And this link's going to be made more and more strongly as we move along. And if people think that's far-fetched, well, look what happened in the Soviet Union. How many dissidents against the Soviet Union tyranny, exposing the tyranny, ended up in mental hospitals to keep them quiet because they were challenging the official version of the Soviet state. Thus they had to be crazy, they had to be mad by definition. The results of these surveys, where they asked people if they agreed with specific statements as to whether governments, for instance, carried out acts of terrorism on their own soil, yes. The results showed that those people who rated highly on the narcissist scale and who had low self-esteem were more likely to be conspiracy believers. Who says? They do. Lead author of the study, a lecturer in social psychology at Kent, again, must be clever, told SciPost.org, because conspiracy theories often refer to malevolent actions of groups, we wanted to distinguish whether it is a narcissistic image of the self or the group that predicts the endorsement of conspiracy theories. Note, it's never, is it the truth that predicts or accepts and endorses conspiracy claims in terms of explaining world events. The link they miss is the link between those who believe in conspiracies and those who believe, because they're intelligent, that governments and those in authority lie. And in terms of evidence, we only have the entire span of known human history to support that obvious fact. And then we've had people, I mentioned it in a video cast recently, we've had some academic who reckons he can prove that conspiracy theories are not true through maths. Note, truth is never part of their equation. You know, we are led to believe, and we are pressured and encouraged to believe, that we must look to academia to tell us what we need to know about the world, because they're clever and they're at university and they've got letters after their name, mate. My experience, and if people looked into this subject more deeply, I'm sure it would be the experience of so many others, is that far from being the bastion of knowledge, most, and I mean most, academia is the pollution of intelligence, because its range of thinking, its range of the possible, is akin to the size of a pea. And I'm being optimistic. People say we must be skeptical. No, we mustn't. We must question. You see, there's such a difference between a skeptic and one who questions. Because one who questions, and people should question everything, including what I say, and see if it stands up. But one who questions is questioning in pursuit of the truth. A skeptic, like those very sad people in the skeptic societies around the world, their foundation from the start is that anything outside their pea-sized norm is not true. So their skepticism is not questioning if something's true, it's setting out from the start to try to convince people that it's not. And that is the mentality that infests and infects so much of what we call academia. And so we have this consensus between academics and politicians and journalists that somehow any idea that there is a conspiracy must be nutty, must be dismissed by reflex action, and, oh, let's cut and paste that. What's that phrase again? Conspiracy theorist, that's it. He's a nutter, he's a conspiracy theorist. That's how it works. And so you have journalists who are so, again, infected by the arrogance of ignorance that they ridicule and dismiss those who are actually doing the job that they should be doing, but don't, as song sheet singers for the system. So let's just look for a second at the official definition of a conspiracy. A secret plan made by two or more people to do something that is harmful or illegal. Now, on that basis, how many conspiracies are there going on at all levels of society every day? The act of secretly planning to do something that is harmful or illegal. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that weren't. Classic. Now, a conspiracy theory is officially defined as this: a theory that explains an event as being the result of a plot by a covert group or organization, a belief that a particular unexplained event was caused by such a group. So people don't conspire in secret to bring about the end that they all desire. That doesn't happen. Apparently not. Two, definition of conspiracy theory, the idea that many important political events or economic and social trends are the products of secret plots that are largely unknown to the general public. How much does the general public know about what's going on in authority and government and the banking system and the corporations? How much do they know? I mean, it's almost in mathematical terms, almost indescribable. It's so small, the amount that the public know about what's really going on compared with what's going on in the shadows and the meetings. But no, it's all a myth. And so what we're being asked to believe, in effect, is that governments tell the truth, and thus there can be no conspiracies by governments to manipulate events by telling lies to bring about an end they want. And what I love, people talk about conspiracy theories, and these academics and journalists and politicians talk about conspiracy theorists. Do you know, for me, the strangest people of all are the coincidence theorists. They're the ones, academics, journalists, politicians, great numbers still members of the public, who think that all these connections, all these names that keep coming up, all these organizations that keep coming up across a great swathe of different areas, all this information showing the connections between apparently unconnected people, organizations, and events is all a coincidence. I mean, I think that's a psychological flaw, I think it's a case of terminal naivety. Maybe the University of Kent should do a study. Be interesting. So, here we are in a situation where, for instance, war criminals like Tony Blair and Boy George Bush and all the people around them and behind them, where the real power is, told us there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, knowing there weren't. They lied through sexed up dossiers. They lied in public statements about the threat of Saddam Hussein because they wanted to invade Iraq because it was on the list of countries to be invaded, which included Libya, Syria, etc. So it comes out, obviously, some of us conspiracy theorists said it before it came out, weapons of mass destruction is a joke. It comes out there weren't any. So there was, under any definition of conspiracy, there was a conspiracy to delude the public into supporting or not opposing the invasion of Iraq on grounds that were known by those that were selling them to be absolutely spurious. But then you say, or you hear, that any idea that there was a conspiracy over 9/11 is a conspiracy theory and they're all mad. It's sobering to ponder on the following. Not just the same agencies, but the very same people who told us there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when they knew they weren't, were the very same people that gave us the official story of 9/11. And what does it say about alleged journalists worldwide? That despite what has been justified in horror and war, slaughter and suffering, on the basis of the official 9/11 story being true. Despite all that, despite the same people telling us that story, telling us there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when they weren't, I have come across yet no credible mainstream media investigation into whether that official story of 9/11 is true. Do you know, I kind of something to encapsulate mainstream journalists and politicians and what have you. I listened to an interview this week with an investment banker. It was an investment banker who operated at a high level in the financial system. And it just shows you how the truth is kept from people, even in the system. That he was an investment banker working in global finance for a long time before he actually realized and grasped how money is created. The fact that money is created out of nothing, out of fresh air on computer screens by private banks, which gives them control of the entire financial system. And as those banks ultimately are controlled by the same network, it gives that network control over the whole financial system. If you go to my website, on the home page, there's a video explanation of how money is created and the whole financial scam. Anyway, eventually, after years in the business at a high level, he realizes, hey, how money is created. He realizes the whole financial system is a scam. He then, with others, puts an event together where he's going to explain the whole financial scam and how money's created out of nothing by private banks. He sends invitations to 1,200 journalists and 179 politicians just to come and see the presentation. Not one single one of any of them replied and certainly did not turn up. And these are the people who are ridiculing, in their arrogance of ignorance, people who can see what they choose not to see. And so what we are seeing and will see more of are attempts to discredit conspiracy researchers. We're now having Google, YouTube, owned by Google, Facebook, even Twitter's coming into it now, in terms of censoring information or trying to undermine the alternative media in many and various ways. We're having this right to be forgotten law extended, announced this very week, where people can be taken out of Google search engines, in effect, because they've just asked to be taken out because they don't like what someone said about them. And what this is, this right to be forgotten, is simply a stepping stone towards George Orwell's memory hole, where information that the authorities don't want people to see just disappears. Google to extend right to be forgotten to all its domains accessed in the EU, it's EU law. Google will begin blocking search results across all its domains when a search takes place within Europe, in an extension of how it implements the right to be forgotten ruling. The ruling allows EU residents to request the removal of search results that they feel link to outdated and irrelevant information they don't want people to see, about themselves on a country-by-country basis. And this is just the start. They'll want to extend this worldwide. You watch. And now, again, continuing this theme of questioning the official story to terrorism, we have a situation where young people who question government or media may be extremists, officials tell parents, because you've got to get to the kids because they're the adults of tomorrow. You don't want them awake. Oh, my goodness, nightmare. Child protection officials have been criticised after warning parents that young people who take issue, wait for this, who take issue with government policy or question what they're told in the media may have been radicalised by extremists. A leaflet drawn up by the Inner City Child Safeguarding Board, how Orwellian is that, warns that, by the way, does this Child Safeguarding Board have a branch in Westminster? If it doesn't, well, what's it doing? So the board warns that appearing angry about government policies, especially foreign policies, is a sign specific to radicalisation. So if you're angry about a government owned by the bankers imposing suffering, austerity and poverty on a vast number of people, you are becoming radicalized as an extremist. You see the constant connection in all these different areas. The same theme is being underlined all the time. Parents and carers have been advised by the Safeguarding Children Board in the London Borough of Camden that showing a mistrust of mainstream media reports and a belief in conspiracy theories could be a sign that children are being groomed by extremists. The leaflet says children who show a combination of these and other signs may be en route to emulating those who have been persuaded to leave the country in secret and against the wishes of their family, putting themselves in extreme danger as a result. You see how they're connecting, questioning all areas of the official story with extremists, especially extremists heading off to Syria. This is the psychological mind game that's going on to get people to put the two together in their minds. Local safeguarding children boards are mandated by government all around the country under the Children's Act of 2004. And we're going to see more and more of this because they want to shut down all questioning of anything outside the official norm. And that, as I've said in a recent video cast, is what political correctness is all about. The idiots that extremists in political correctness who seek to impose those destroying pressures on freedom of speech that make people frightened to speak their mind and speak their truth. They're just agents of government, but they have no idea that that's what they are because they're idiots. Bella Sankey, policy director of the campaign group Liberty, criticised the leaflet. Children should be encouraged to take an interest in politics and think critically about what they see in the media, not deemed suspect for doing so. But that is the idea, to make that the case. And so we have had kids at school reported to the authorities and the police for doing things like going to the UKIP website, which is an official political party fighting elections in this country, actually opposing the EU. What was this other one? An A-level student was reported to the police by his headmaster, to the police, for criticising the school in a blog. The student was apparently, according to the headmaster, developing into an anarchist. I wonder if I should report the headmaster for developing into an idiot. See, what we have here is a very simple situation. Not every last fact, not every last claim that conspiracy researchers say about the world is 100% accurate. And there are those who say things that I shake my head about. because there's nothing to support it. But the fact is, the great body of conspiracy research, which is cross-referencing information and cross-referencing conclusions, is explaining why the world is as it is, why the few control the world, why we've reached a point now where 1% of the population owns around 50% of the wealth of the world, why this is not an accident, why this is not random. It's designed, it's a conspiracy to bring this about. Just as there's a conspiracy, the same conspiracy, different face, to bring about a police state so the 1% can impose their will on the rest of the population. And when you are selling lies to try to persuade the public that events are random when they're all going in a particular direction, you don't want them to see that. You want them to see dots, not pictures. When your whole foundation of what you want to achieve is based on lies, then of course what you have to do is suppress sources telling the truth about what you're doing and exposing what you're doing. And that's what we're seeing now, and that's why this whole thing with conspiracy theorists is increasing all the time. And we're also seeing that more and more people are looking at these explanations and going, well, you know, they make more sense of the world than what the authorities have done in us. And this is why audiences for mainstream media organizations are falling, many like a stone. And the audience for the alternative media is increasing and increasing and increasing. As long as people are getting crazier and crazier and crazier, it's because they're awakening to what's really going on more and more. And you'll see these attacks on the alternative media, people like me and many others around the world, the alternative media in general, you'll see them increasing. See, in terms of my case, they have tried for years and years and years to dismiss me and discredit me through ridicule. That Ike's mad. But it hasn't worked. It's worked with people that will believe anything and don't read what someone's saying so they can see with their own mind. But with intelligent people, more and more and more, truly intelligent people, not academically intelligent people as they claim, which is not really intelligence, most of it. It's cleverness, which is very different. Remembering facts is cleverness. Intelligence is making sense of those facts. And actually seeing that many of the facts aren't facts at all. So they're trying to ridicule me, but more and more people are looking at what I'm doing anyway. I'm just about to start a world tour. I'm going to talk to thousands of people all over the world, literally all over the world. So the ridicule's not worked. So what you'll see, and it will be the case with the alternative media in general, is it will turn to hostility and to antagonism and condemnation and all that stuff. And what's happening now is summed up in this quote by Gandhi. First they ignore you, been there. Then they laugh at you, been there. Then they fight you, coming. Then you win, coming. Well, let's look at some conspiracy theories. I read a paper this week which encapsulated so much, not just about what's going on in Syria and the Middle East, but actually how the game works, how the psychological game works. And it's called the Caesar photo fraud that undermined Syrian negotiations. 12 problems with the story of mass torture and execution in Syria. It's by a guy called Rick Sterling. from the Syria Solidarity Movement, and dated this month. And it says in the introduction, there is a pattern of sensational but untrue reports that lead to public acceptance of US and Western military intervention in countries around the world. And he gives these examples. In Gulf War I, there were reports of Iraqi troops stealing incubators from Kuwait, leaving babies to die on the cold floor. Amnesty International incorrectly verified these false accusations. 10 years later, there were reports of yellow cake uranium going to Iraq for development of weapons of mass destruction. Turned out not to be true at all. 1 decade later, there were reports of Libyan soldiers drugged on Viagra and raping women as they advanced. All these proved nonsense later. In 2012, NBC broadcaster Richard Engel was supposedly kidnapped by pro-Assad Syrian militia, but luckily freed by Syrian opposition fighters, the Free Syrian Army, i.e. The proxy army for the US and the West. All these reports, this document says, were later confirmed to be fabrications and lies. They all had the goal of manipulating public opinion, and they all succeeded in one way or another. Despite the consequences, which were often disastrous, none of the perpetrators were punished or paid any price. The Washington, D.C. politicians and consulting firm who created the incubator hoax were never reprimanded, let alone punished. Libya is in chaos today, yet who has been held to account? Well, the reason they're not being held to account is because they're basically doing what the authorities want, and the authorities are not going to hold to account those that have done what they wanted them to do. Richard Engel understood the kidnapping was a hoax, but stayed quiet until the true story was about to be publicly revealed. It has been famously said, those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. This report is a critical review of the Caesar torture photos story. As will be shown, there is strong evidence the accusations are entirely or substantially false. Now, this is the overview and the timeline of these Caesar torture photos. And these photographs have been used to demonize the Assad regime in Syria, which is what the cabal wants, and also to destroy so-called peace talks. Because you say you want to have peace talks because you want the public to believe you really care about peace, but you make sure that you trash and make fall apart the peace talks. This is what's happening, of course, all the time in the whole history of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. The Israeli authorities and the US authorities, they say we want peace talks, or well, let's have peace talks, and then they'll do something to trash the peace talks so they don't go anywhere. That's the whole way that it works. Anyway, this is the overview and the timeline. On 20th of January 2014, 2 days before negotiations about the Syrian conflict were scheduled to begin in Switzerland, a sensational report burst onto television and front pages around the world. The story was that a former Syrian army photographer had 55,000 photographs documenting the torture and killing of 11,000 detainees by the Syrian security establishment. The Syrian photographer was given the code name Caesar. The story became known as the Caesar torture photos. A team of lawyers plus digital and forensic experts were hired by the Carter Ruck law firm. Satirical magazine in Britain calls that law firm something else. Hired by the Carter Ruck law firm on contract to Qatar, which hates Assad, which has funded and helped to arm those fighting Assad. I mean, what a joke. A team of lawyers plus digital forensic experts from this firm, they went to the Middle East and checked the veracity, so they say, of the Caesar story. They concluded, sits back in amazement, takes a deep breath, struggling to cope. They concluded that Caesar was truthful. Oh, really? Surprise. And the photographs indicated industrial scale killing. Say anything that discredits Assad. CNN, London's Guardian, and Le Monde broke the story, which was subsequently broadcast in news reports around the world. Comparisons were made to the Nazis and Khmer Rouge. Always bring the Nazis out when you want to discredit somebody. You want to regime change. As the Assad government in Syria was demonized and demands that Assad must go were strengthened. That's the idea of it. The Syrian government denied the accusation, saying the photos show foreign terrorists from several nationalities who have been killed when attacking the military checkpoints and civil institutions, and part of them are civilian and military personnel who were tortured and killed by the armed terrorist groups because of their support for the Assad regime. For the past 2 years, the report says, the story has been preserved with occasional bursts of publicity, attention, and supposedly corroborating reports. Significant milestones include January 20th, 2014, the story was first broadcast. January the 22nd, the Caesar torture photos story was announced at the UN-sponsored negotiations. The Syrian government was vilified and negotiations soon broke down. Mission accomplished. April 2014, the Caesar photographs were exhibited to informal United Nations Security Council meetings. July of that year, wearing a hood and covering his face, Caesar testified at the Congressional Foreign Relations Committee. In the October, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington hosted an exhibit of Caesar photographs. March 2015, the Syrian Association for Missing and Conscience Detainees posted about 7,000 Caesar photographs at their newly launched website. In October 2015, the Syrian Network for Human Rights issued a report entitled The Photographed Holocaust, analytical study of the leaked pictures of torture victims in Syrian military hospitals. December 2015, Human Rights Watch published a report, If the Dead Could Speak, Mass Deaths and Torture in Syria's Detention Facilities. As another, this is the February of 2016, as another effort at negotiations to stop the conflict in Syria was launched in Geneva, Caesar torture photos were brought for display. And I mentioned there a number of different organizations. And people would say, well, it must be true. They're all saying it. But they're all saying it from the same so-called evidence. And they're all coming from this official line, demonize Assad so we can get rid of him. Because we want to do that and have had him on our list for years. Decades, in truth. So this report goes on. Problems with the story of mass torture and execution in Syria. One, almost half the photos show the opposite of the allegations. See, I've said many times, watch the voiceover. It's like in television reports. You've got pictures, right? And with no voiceover, you just got pictures. And you're looking at the pictures and you're seeing what you make of them. What the voiceover does is tell you what to make of the pictures, to tell you what you're looking at. And it's the same in things like this. You have these pictures of dead people, and then the narrative tells you why they're dead. It's not necessarily true. Most of the time it's not. But that's not the point. It's you believing it's true that's the point. Okay, the Carter Rock Inquiry team claimed there were about 55,000 photographs total, and about half of them taken by Caesar and the other half by other photographers. The Carter Rock team claimed the photos were all similar. Together they're known as the Caesar torture photos. The photographs are in the custody of an opposition organization called the Syrian Association for Missing Conscience Detainees. The background of that we should ask about. In 2015, they allowed Human Rights Watch to study all the photos, which have otherwise been secret. So we haven't seen them; they've just told us what they show. Classic. This is so classic about the way the propaganda works. In December 2015, Human Rights Watch released their report entitled "If the Dead Could Speak." The biggest revelation is that over 46% of these photographs, 24,568, do not show people tortured to death by the Syrian government. So there's half of them gone straight away. I'm not saying there was no torture, and there is no torture. I'm just saying the scale they're talking about is extraordinary in its ludicrousness, based on the evidence that they're claiming. On the contrary, these photographs show dead Syrian soldiers and victims of car bombs and other violence. Thus, nearly half the photos show the opposite of what was alleged. These photos, never revealed to the public, confirm that the opposition is violent and has killed large numbers of Syrian security forces and civilians. So the sensational initial story, which was put out by the world media, unquestioned, in all, approximately 55,000 images have to date been made available. This approximates to there being images of about 11,000 dead detainees. But the truth, Human Rights Watch was given access to 53,275 unique files and revealed that 24,568 images show dead army soldiers and members of the security forces, the very opposite of what is being claimed, and crime scene photographs, including the aftermath of explosions, assassinations of security officers, fires, and car bombs. 2. The claim that other photos show only tortured detainees is exaggerated or false. The Carter Ruck report says that Caesar only photographed bodies brought from the Syrian government detention centres and showing signs of starvation, brutal beating, strangulation, and other forms of torture and killing. In their December 2015 report, Human Rights Watch said the largest category of photographs, 28,707 images, of photographs Human Rights Watch understands to have died in government custody, either in one of several detention centres or after being transferred to a military hospital. They estimate 6,786 dead individuals in the set. The key question, though, is how and where did these people die? Were they all detainees tortured and killed by the regime, as claimed by the Carter Ruck team? Did they all die in government custody, as claimed by Human Rights Watch? These assertions, the report says, are very dubious. Although we've only been allowed to see a small percentage of the photographs, these suggest victims who died in a wide variety of circumstances. Over 80% of the photographs are from branches 227 Damascus and 215 Secret Raids and Intrusions. In their work at the borders and within conflict zones, they would encounter all the following: dead and injured opposition fighters, dead and injured civilians, dead and injured Syrian soldiers and allies. Some of the victims may have been prisoners executed by one of the armed opposition groups. When encountering victims of the conflict, the Syrian military would transfer the bodies to the military hospitals where the injured could be treated and the deceased processed and buried. And they show different images of dead people, page after page, who are dead people. There's no indication of how and why they died in the ones that they show there. In summary, the report says, the photos and the deceased are real, but how they died and the circumstances are unclear. There is strong evidence some died in conflict. These photographers or photographs seem to document a wartime situation where many combatants and civilians were killed. It seems the military hospital was doing what it was always there to do, maintaining a photographic and documentary record of the deceased. Bodies were picked up by different military or intelligence branches. While some may have died in detention, the big majority probably died in the conflict zones. The accusations by Caesar that the Carter Ruck report and the Human Rights Watch report, that these are all victims of death in detention or death by torture or death in government custody, are almost certainly false. There's certainly no evidence to show that. 3. The true identity of Caesar is probably not as claimed. The Carter Ruck report says the witness who defected from Syria and who had been working for the Syrian government was given the code name Caesar by the inquiry team to protect the witness and members of his family. However, as the report says, if this story is true, it would be easy for the Syrian government to determine who he really is. After all, how many military photographers took photos at Chishreen and Military 601 hospitals during those years and then disappeared? According to the Carter Ruck report, Caesar's family left Syria around the same time. Considering this, why is Caesar keeping his identity secret from the Western audience? Why does Caesar refuse to meet even with the highly sympathetic journalists and researchers? Caesar's story changes in significant ways over time. Based in December 2013, or based on 2013 December interviews, the Carter-Ruck report says the inquiry team was informed by Caesar that for the last 3 years, his only job together with others in this section was to photograph and document bodies of detainees who had been killed. But in interviews in the summer of 2015 with some of these organizations, Caesar changed the account to include victims of massacres, plus some of the victims' bodies belonged to armed opposition groups who were killed or injured during the clashes with government forces. 4. The Carter-Ruck inquiry was faulty, rushed, and politically biased. And this, first of all, that's a classic, because so many people who have supplied intelligence which says things that justify what this cabal wants to do, like the people that supplied the evidence for the sexed-up dossier to justify the invasion of Iraq, are just government plants. They just make them up. They just get somebody and get them to say what the cabal wants them to say. Classic. And so is this, the inquiry, where the result of the inquiry is decided before the inquiry meets. This is what happens with almost all government inquiries. And inquiries connected to what the government wants the inquiry to conclude. The Carter-Ruck inquiry was faulty, rushed, and politically biased. The credibility of the Caesar story has been substantially based on the Carter-Ruck inquiry team, which was supposed to check the authenticity of the defecting photographer and his photographs. The following facts suggest the team was biased with a political motive. Nothing new there then. The investigation was financed by the government of Qatar, which is a major supporter of the armed opposition. Well, it's dead in the water. Any credibility is already dead in the water before I go on. But you see, when these things are reported, like these findings are reported, that's kind of lost in the text. The headlines and the main text is just saying what the report found. It doesn't give you the background to the report, certainly the detailed background and those behind it and who funded it. That's either in the fine print lower down or not at all. The contracted law firm Carter-Ruck & Company has previously represented Turkey's President Erdogan, nice man, trust him, also known for his avid support of the armed opposition. The American on the legal inquiry team, Professor David M. Crane, has a long history working for the US Department of Defense and Defense Intelligence Agency. The US government has been deeply involved in the attempt at regime change in Syria, with demands that Assad must go, beginning in summer 2011 and continuing until recently. Professor Crane is personally partisan in the conflict. He has campaigned for a Syrian war crimes tribunal and testified before Congress in October 2013, 3 months before the Caesar revelations. By their own admission, the inquiry team was under time constraints. You've got to get it out by then, because that's when it's going to be most effective for us. By their own admission, the inquiry team did not even survey most of the photographs. The inquiry team was either ignorant of the content or intentionally lied about the 46% showing dead Syrian soldiers and attack victims. The inquiry team did their last interview with Caesar on January the 18th, quickly finalised a report and rushed it to the media on January the 20th, 2 days later, 2 days prior to the start of UN-sponsored negotiations on a peaceful settlement in Syria, or a settlement in Syria anyway. The self-proclaimed rigour of the Carter-Ruck investigation is without foundation. The claims to be a scientific investigation are verging on the ludicrous, the report rightly says. And it goes on, one might question why Qatar would want to subvert the negotiations. In her book, Hard Choices, former Secretary of State Clinton described the situation in 2012. Qatar and Saudi Arabia, quote, backed the rebels and wanted Assad gone. Well, that's why. They wanted to subvert the negotiations. As shown in the BBC report from January 22, 2014, the leading Syrian rebel groups say they reject the peace conference. The Caesar story contributed to poisoning the atmosphere and undermining negotiations. 5. The US Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, is involved. In an interview on France 24, Professor David Crane of the inquiry team described how Caesar was brought to meet them by his handler, his case officer. The expression case officer usually refers to the CIA. This would be a common expression for Professor Crane, who previously worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency. The involvement of the CIA additionally makes sense since there was a CIA budget of $1 billion for Syria operations in 2013. Professor Crane's Syria Accountability Project is based at Syracuse University, where the CIA actively recruits new officers despite student resistance. What does it matter if the CIA is connected to the Caesar story? Because the CIA has a long history of disinformation campaigns. In 2011, false reports of Viagra-fueled rape by Libyan soldiers were widely broadcast in Western media as the US pushed for a military mandate. Decades earlier, the world was shocked to hear about Cuban troops fighting in Angola, raping Angolan women. The CIA chief of station for Angola, John Stockwell, later described how they invented the false report and spread it around the world. This is happening all the time. And the journalists who say, oh, it's a conspiracy theory, just repeat it without question. The CIA was very proud of that disinformation achievement. Stockwell's book, In Search of Enemies, is still enemies. That was probably that was a Freudian slip. In Search of Enemies is still relevant. In Search of Enemies, crikey. CIA, White House, Congress, on and on it goes. The Carter-Ruck report does not mention how the interviews with Caesar were conducted. Was the interview conducted in English? Does Caesar speak English? When Caesar testified at a congressional committee, there was a translator. When Caesar was interviewed on 3 separate days by the Carter-Ruck inquiry team, was the CIA case officer his translator? If so, there would obviously be a question about the authenticity of the interview. 6. The prosecutors portray simple administrative procedures as mysterious and sinister. This is another common trait. Make something out of nothing. The Carter-Ruck inquiry team falsely claimed that there were about 11,000 tortured and killed detainees. They then posed the question, why would the Syrian government photograph and document the people they just killed? Well, of course they wouldn't, because if it got out, then they'd be demonized and there'd be more justification for armed conflict against them. But no, something as simple as that is can't be true, because if it's true, then that undermines the fact that these photographs are genuine in terms of what they claim to portray. The Carter-Ruck report speculates that the military hospital photographed the dead to prove that the orders to kill had been followed. Oh, nice one. The orders to kill, as the report says, are assumed. A more logical explanation is that dead bodies were photographed as part of the normal hospital morgue procedure to maintain a file of the deceased who were received or treated at the hospital. The same applies to the body labeling numbering system. The Carter-Ruck report suggests there is something mysterious and probably sinister in the coded tagging system, but all morgues have a tagging and identification system. Another example of hyperbole and distortion is the comparison of the military overflow morgue to a slaughterhouse. In a war situation, there are obviously high numbers of deaths and the normal morgue facilities can become inadequate. What to do? The Syrians used an outside covered garage area for wrapping the bodies in plastic in preparation for transport and burial. Sinister, as the report says? Not really. 7. The photos have been tampered with. Many of the photos at this organization's website have been manipulated. The information card and tape identity are covered over, and sections of documents are obscured. It must have been very time-consuming to do this for thousands of photos. The explanation that they're doing this is to protect the identity of the person, but it's not credible, the report says, quite rightly, since the faces of the victims are visible. What are they hiding? They're hiding, obviously, who they are. 8. The photo catalogue has duplicates and other errors. There are numerous errors and anomalies in the photo catalogue as presented by this website. For example, some deceased persons are shown twice with different case numbers and dates. 9. With few exceptions, Western media uncritically accepted and promoted the story. Now here we have another common theme. What I'm presenting here is not just about the Syria situation, as I mentioned earlier. This is a classic on how these propaganda campaigns to demonize targets are run and how they operate. With few exceptions, Western media uncritically accepted and promoted the story. The Carter-Ruck report was misleadingly labelled confidential while being distributed to CNN, The Guardian, and Le Monde. CNN's Christiane Amanpour gushed. Good evening. This is Christiana Amanpour. You hate Assad. You hate Putin. Thank you. Good night. That's pretty much sums up her programs. She gushed the story as she interviewed 3 of the inquiry team under the headline, "Exclusive, Gruesome Syria Photos May Prove Torture by Assad Regime." Critical journalism was replaced by leading questions and affirmations. David Crane said, "This is a smoking gun." Desmond De Silva likened the images to those of Holocaust survivors. The Guardian report was titled, "Syrian Regime Document Trove Shows Evidence of Industrial-Scale Killing of Detainees." Sitting on the fence then. With the subtitle, "Senior War Crimes Prosecutors Say Photographs and Documents Provide Clear Evidence of Systematic Killing of 11,000 Detainees." Well, we've already seen that at least half of them absolutely don't do that. One of the very few skeptical reports was by Dan Murphy in the Christian Science Monitor. Murphy echoed standard accusations about Syria, but went on to say incisively, "The report itself is nowhere near as credible as it makes out and should be viewed for what it is, a well-timed propaganda exercise funded by Qatar, a regime opponent who has funded rebels fighting Assad who have committed war crimes of their own." Unfortunately, as the report says, that was one of the very few critical reports in the mainstream media. 10. Another classic. Politicians have used the Caesar story to push for more US-NATO aggression. Politicians seeking direct US intervention for regime change in Syria were also quick to accept and broadcast the Caesar story. It says what we want people to believe, so let them have it. They used it to demonize the Assad government and argue that the US must act so as to prevent another Holocaust, another Rwanda, another Cambodia. When Caesar's photos were displayed at the House Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress, Chairman Ed Royce said, "It is far past the time that the world act. It is far past the time for the United States to say there is going to be a safe zone across this area of northern Syria." A safe zone means an invasion. Safe zone is the new and friendlier sounding expression for no-fly zone, the report says. In reality, there are already a safe zone free from combat, the border with Turkey. Moving the safe zone 10 or 20 miles south would entail invading a sovereign country and dramatically increase the number of deaths and casualties. But the proponents of this count on public ignorance and misleading terminology to promote interventionist goals, which is what this propaganda is all about. The top-ranking Democrat in the House Foreign Affairs Committee is Eliot Engel. In November 2015, he said, "We're reminded of the photographer known as Caesar, who sat in this room a year ago, showing us in searing graphic detail what Assad has done to his own people." Engel went on to advocate for a new authorization for use of military force. All these are different examples of there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, so we must invade. Republican Senator John McCain, who, I'd call him evil, except evil will probably sue for defamation of character. Republican Senator John McCain is another politician eager to escalate aggression against Syria, against anybody. He claims to keep some Caesar photos in his desk as a daily reminder. Yes, all right. Yes, McCain, yes. Republican or Representative Adam Kinzinger is another advocate for aggression against Syria. At an event at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in July 2015, he said, "If we want to destroy ISIS, we have to destroy the incubator of ISIS, Bashar al-Assad." The idea that the Syrian people and the Syrian army have lost so many people to attacks by ISIS and other Western-backed terrorists, and then he gets accused of being the incubator for those that are destroying his country and seeking to displace him. I mean, you vote for idiots, you get idiocy. The irony and hypocrisy is doubly profound since Kinzinger has met and coordinated with opposition leader Icke, who is a confirmed ally of ISIS. In contrast with Kinzinger's false claims, it is widely known that ISIS ideology and initial funding came from Saudi Arabia, and much of its recent wealth from oil sales via Turkey. The Syrian army has fought huge battles against ISIS, winning some but losing others, with horrific scenes of mass beheading. Number 11, the Human Rights Watch assessment is biased. Another thing that people need to watch are the so-called organizations that represent something. They may say they represent freedom. Now, some might. Many don't. They're just fronts. And of course, people will have to look at organizations like Human Rights Watch and just say, look into the background and then decide for themselves if they're credible or not. You know, it's like the Orwellian method. If you want to hide an organization that's running drugs, then call it the anti-drug agency. This is how it works. It's all making people look over there when the truth is over here. Human Rights Watch has been very active around Syria. After the chemical attacks in Greater Damascus in August 2013, Human Rights Watch rushed, maybe that's another Freudian slip. Whitewash, I don't know. Rushed a report which concluded that based on a vector analysis of incoming projectiles, the source of the sarin carrying rockets must have been the Syrian government territory. This analysis was later debunked as a junk heap of bad evidence by highly respected investigative journalist Robert Parry. Human Rights Watch's assumption about the chemical weapon rocket flight distance was faulty. Additionally, it was unrealistic to think you could determine rocket trajectory with 1% accuracy from a canister on the ground. To think you could determine flight trajectory from a canister on the ground that had deflected off a building wall was preposterous. But people who read that, overwhelmingly, those that don't question events, they would just read that Assad had used chemical weapons on his own people. Well, Human Rights Watch, they did a report, and they're Human Rights Watch, they believe in human rights. Why would they lie, or why would they mislead? In spite of this, Human Rights Watch stuck by its analysis, which blamed the Assad government. The organization's director, Ken Roth, publicly indicated dissatisfaction when an agreement to remove Syrian chemical weapons was reached. Mr. Roth wanted more than a symbolic attack. Well, that'd be human rights for the people underneath it then. In the light of the proceeding, we note that the December 2015 Human Rights Watch report addressing the claims of Caesar, the organization seems to be the only non-governmental organization to receive the full set of photos from the custodian. To its credit, Human Rights Watch acknowledged that nearly half the photos do not show what has been claimed for 2 years. They show Syrian soldiers and militia, along with scenes from crime scenes, car bombings, etc. But Human Rights Watch's bias is clearly shown in how they handle this huge contradiction. Amazingly, they suggest the incorrectly identified photographs support the overall claim. They say, this report focuses on deaths in detention. However, other types of photographs are also important. From an evidentiary perspective, they reinforce the credibility of the claims of Caesar about his role as a forensic photographer of the Syrian security forces, or at least with someone who had access to their photographs. This seems like saying if someone lies to you half the time, that proves they are truthful. Despite the obvious contradictions, Human Rights Watch supports the Caesar story, just as they've stuck with the faulty theory about chemical weapons attacks by the Assad regime in August 2013. It is striking, the report says, that Human Rights Watch, their report, has no acknowledgement of the war conditions and circumstances in Syria. There is no acknowledgement that the government and Syrian Arab army have been under attack by tens of thousands of weaponized fighters in hundreds of armed opposition groups, openly funded and supported by many of the wealthiest countries in the world. There is no hint at the huge loss of life suffered by the Syrian army and supporters defending their country. The current estimates range from 80 to 120,000 Syrian soldiers, militia and allies having died in the conflict. During the 3 years, 2011 to 2013, including the period covered by Caesar photos, it is estimated that over 52,000 Syrian soldiers and civilian militia died versus 29,000 anti-government forces. 12. The legal accusations are biased and ignore the supreme crime of aggression. And of course, this is what happens. You invade in a country, either for a proxy army or directly, and you bomb civilians from the sky in Libya to protect them from violence. But that's never considered as terrorism. It's never considered as violence. Only the response from those you are attacking is considered violence and terrorism. And this is supported by all the courts, the world war crimes courts and all this stuff, all connected to the same cabal, which is why the real culprits never get before them. The Christian Science Monitor journalist Dan Murphy gave an apt warning in his article on the Carter Ruck report about Caesar. While many journalists treated the prosecutors as with uncritical deference, he said, association with war crime prosecutions is no guarantor of credibility, far from it. Just consider Luis Moreno Ocampo's absurd claims about Viagra and mass rape in Gaddafi's Libya in 2011. War crimes prosecutors have, unsurprisingly, a bias towards wanting to bolster cases against people they consider war criminals, like Assad and Gaddafi, and so should be treated with caution. They also frequently favour, as a class, humanitarian interventions, but they're humanitarian interventions as an excuse, not as a reality. The Carter Ruck legal team, the report says, demonstrated how accurate those cautions were. They were eager to accuse the Syrian government of crimes against humanity, but the evidence of industrial killing, mass killing, torturing to kill is dubious, and much of the hard evidence shows something else. In contrast, there is a clear and solid evidence against a crime against peace that is being committed against Syria. It is public knowledge that the armed opposition in Syria has been funded, supplied and supported in myriad ways by various outside governments. Most of the fighters, both Syrian and foreign, receive salaries from one or another outside power. Their supplies, weapons and necessary equipment are all supplied to them. Like the Contras in Nicaragua in the 1980s, the use of such proxy armies is a violation of customary international law. The government of Qatar has been a major supporter of the mercenaries and fanatics attacking the sovereign state of Syria. Given that fact, isn't it hugely ironic to hear the legal contractors for Qatar accusing the Syrian government of crimes against humanity? Ironic on one level, par for the course on another. So the report concludes, huge numbers of people have died horrible deaths in the Syrian conflict. Regarding the Caesar photos, it will take much more objective, rigorous and scientific investigation with all the original photographs in their original archived form to accurately understand who these victims are and how most of them died. While the photos are real, the Caesar story of 11,000 victims of torture and killing is substantially false. With few exceptions, mainstream media accepted and promoted the story without serious inquiry. The Caesar story played a role in demonizing the Syrian government and disrupting the UN-sponsored negotiations. Western media and humanitarian organizations are quick to accuse the Syrian government of war crimes on the basis of hearsay and without solid evidence. The same organizations ignore war crimes or crimes of aggression and crimes against peace by the West and their allies. So that's how it works, and that's a classic example of the creation of propaganda and how different parties come together to make that happen. So one other story this week, and it's of course one of the stories that's dominated the week, has been the attempted deal between the EU and Turkey to at least slow down the flow of migrants into Europe. And it's an extraordinary deal, not least because it's with a man who claims to be an elected democratic president of Turkey, Erdogan. And the man is a tyrant who is doing extraordinary things in his country in terms of human rights and freedom of the media, while at the same time these bastions of alleged freedom and open society, like Cameron, are negotiating with this man who's actually doing that. The headline here: the EU's migrant €6 billion euro deal with Turkey's despot isn't just shabby, it's terrifying. And the writer, Michael Burley, says, after some political dust-up or another, David Cameron may occasionally wish he could send the riot police to the offices of the Daily Mail and have the editor dragged out. Of course, he would never be allowed such an appalling abuse of power, well, given time. Such an appalling abuse of power, yet that is exactly what another national leader, one with pretensions to join the EU, has just done. Last Friday, an edict from the Turkish courts with the blessing of the all-powerful President Erdogan saw police storm into Turkey's biggest-selling daily newspaper and use tear gas as they rounded up the staff. This is in a country alleged to be democratic and part of the coalition against Assad in Syria. The reason? The paper had run disobliging stories about the despotic premier, such as a focus on the £400 million he spent on a 1,000-room White Palace for his own use, or the fact that a radio DJ was arrested for insulting the president on Twitter. It's against the law to insult the president of Turkey in a democratic country. But then there is it says here, but then there is a statute in Turkey called Article 299, which decrees that insulting the head of state is an offence, even though he's offensive. Which is why a schoolteacher was sentenced to almost a year in prison for making a rude hand gesture at a political rally, and a former Miss Turkey was prosecuted for insulting the leader by posting a satirical poem online. Meanwhile, opposition satellite television stations have been taken off air and 20 journalists jailed. It may sound like a banana republic as portrayed in a far-fetched Hollywood film, but this is the reality of life in a nation which is this week in the process of blackmailing the entire European Union. In short, Erdogan and his Prime Minister are demanding €6 billion from the EU, no less than £500 million, of which should come from Britain or could come from Britain, to check the relentless flow of largely Muslim migrants making their way across the Aegean Sea to Greece and further west. The implicit message is clear. If the money is not forthcoming, the floodgates will be opened and the social and religious fabric of Europe could be changed forever. And this brings us full circle, really. Because while the mainstream media dismiss conspiracy theories and theorists, as they call them, and ridicule them and try to discredit them, the very conspiracy that they dismiss, and some don't in private actually, they just haven't got the bottle to say it publicly. While that's dismissal's going on, the very conspiracy they're dismissing is closing in on them. Because what we're seeing in Turkey, so-called democratic country. Joke, yes, but Britain's a joke democratic country. The United States is a joke democratic country in terms of freedom that democracy is supposed to stand for. And so what we're seeing in Syria, or in Turkey rather, is planned for everywhere eventually. And so they're looking at what's happening in Turkey. They're seeing journalists arrested using tear gas in newspaper offices. They're seeing television stations shut down and journalists jailed simply for telling the truth. And yet they dismiss a conspiracy of which that is part, which will eventually knock on their door and knock on their children's door even more, and knock on their grandchildren's door even more. And it really is time for mainstream journalists and mainstream academics to grow up, to find within them some level of maturity, to break out of their program, to break out of their perception program and see what's really going on. Because if they don't, then by the time it gets to them, their ability to change tack and tell people what's really going on will no longer be there, because there won't be the means of communication for anyone in the media that wants to tell the truth. These next 3 years are crucial, not least for mainstream people who are not part of the conspiracy but are agents of it, overwhelmingly unknowingly, overwhelmingly through ignorance. They're crucial years for them because their lives will be targeted and their jobs will be targeted by this force when it has expanded enough to pull them into the tyranny. Indeed, already it's there in terms of journalism through self-censorship, knowing that if you say this, there'll be consequences. So you just don't say it. What's coming is not just self-censorship, but imposed authoritarian censorship, which is what we're now seeing in Turkey, in a supposedly democratic country. Oh no, it would never happen in a democracy. Tell the Turks that.